they told me that I had cancer, they were also able to tell me with a good degree of certainty that I wasn't going to die. I think that they were able to say that because of the work that Terry Fox has done and because of the work that everybody in all the schools has done. Oh, he's my hero. I don't think that there's an individual on the planet like him, really.
Shakespeare once wrote, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." Terry Fox was not born great. In fact, it was the cruelest twist of fate imaginable that would eventually propel his name into the headlines and his memory into the pages of Canadian history. It's sometimes easy to forget that when Terry Fox began his marathon, he was just a very ordinary young man, barely out of his teens. The last thing he ever wanted to be was a hero.
As an athlete, he pushed me, challenged me to give it my best. And ultimately, his journey inspired me to consider my physical challenge as a way to give back and to contribute by bringing a message about ability.
Most people probably have had an experience in their life where there's a feeling, a tingle that goes through you that leaves you with an everlasting or an impacting feeling. And he did that to me.
In 3.5 years, the third time I've been in water.
The story I wrote when he got sick is the only story out of the thousands that I've written over the years that I actually remember the first sentence to, and it was, "He gave us a dream as big as our country." And I thought he did.
Well, I'll do a short little speech here before I carry on. I hope you can all understand me. I'll tell you shortly why I'm running across Canada and what happened to me. When I was 18 years old in Vancouver, BC, I had a pain develop on the right side of my knee.
It was an early start. We get up at 4:30, and Terry ran usually about 12 miles in the morning. It'd be 9 o'clock. And then he would stop, and we'd find a restaurant, or we'd have to deal with Doug's cooking. And Terry would eat as much food as he possibly could. And then he would sleep for the balance of the morning. He'd start running at 12 o'clock, and he'd run 14, 16 miles, depending on how he was feeling.
We'd have to put a little plastic bag out on the side of the road. We'd cover it with gravel where he finished, and the next morning, Doug had to pull the truck up so that when he opened the truck door, he could step right on that plastic bag.
And he would get up in the absolute quiet of pre-dawn, and he'd wrap himself in his sleeping bag in the back of his van. Everyone was very, very quiet. And he'd drive to the place where he'd stopped the night before, and he'd get out slowly, and it would be dark and lovely and quiet, a moon shining, farms around us, and he would run. It was a startling sight. It was almost a frightening sight because you could see it was hard. You could see that he was running, and it was an effort. There was nothing easy about it. But what also struck me was that he was alone. And I thought, is this what it's going to be like all the way across the country?
Of course, no one could ever have predicted that the Terry Fox Marathon of Hope would cast off its unpretentious start and become a phenomenon, the likes of which Canada has never witnessed, before or since. In the beginning, there was only the dogged determination of one Terence Stanley Fox. He was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on July 28, 1958. The second son in a family of 4 children. His father, Raleigh, worked on the CN Railroad, and Betty Fox was the dependable matriarch of this salt-of-the-earth, all-Canadian family. From an early age, patience, tenacity, and perseverance were Terry's hallmarks.
We'd sit him up in his high chair at the kitchen table and give him blocks and a little plastic man and so on to play with. And he'd sit for hours and hours and hours setting those up. And they'd go flying because of that temper, even at that age. But he wouldn't, we'd pick them up, give them back to him, and he'd still sit there until they actually did what he wanted them to do.
He loved to play sports. He loved to beat his dad and his brothers at anything, whether it was table hockey, street hockey, wrestling, badminton in the backyard. Yeah, Terry loved to win, and it showed. I mean, he was very competitive.
When Terry was 7, the family moved to the suburbs of Vancouver, where he developed his passion for sport. It was here, too, that he made a lifelong friend.
95% of Terry's improvement came from hard work. If I practiced 1 hour a day, he'd practice 2 hours a day.
I'd never seen a student lose so many one-on-one games. I'd never seen a student not quit, though, in trying. And over 2 or 3 years of working, he worked himself to the point where he was literally a starter on the basketball team.
Port Coquitlam High School, today renamed after Terry, was where in grade 12 he shared the Athlete of the Year award with Doug. He'd played basketball, soccer, and was fearless on the rugby pitch. And now, every year, the athlete who most exemplifies Terry's spirit is honored with the Terry Fox Award. Terry's graduation in 1976 was a proud moment for the Fox family. Yet, in the matter of a few short months, the youthful dreams of Terry Fox would be dealt the most crushing blow.
Terry had had a very sore right knee for several months, and we would try to get him to see a doctor, and he wouldn't. And we were all with him when Dr. Piper came in and told Terry that he had a very bad news, that it wasn't a sports injury, that what he had was a malignant tumor just below his right knee, and it was called an osteogenic sarcoma, bone cancer.
It was every parent's worst nightmare. Terry's leg would be amputated 3 days later. Yet more than 20 years after that dreadful moment, what the family remembers most was Terry's bravery.
Swore a bit, but the whole family was there, including Doug Allward. And he took it, cried a bit for a few minutes, and then just seemed to straighten up. And in his thoughts, I guess this was just another challenge.
The only I could come up with was why you, Terry? And Terry just said, why not me?
When I first lost my leg, I was in total shock because I was prepared for some type of operation to prepare a cartilage or a ligament problem in my knee, and I was not prepared for losing a leg. But it was a good thing for me because only 2 days later, I was shown an article of a man who ran on one leg, and I am a very competitive type person, and I said if he could do it, I could do it too. And right from the very beginning, I have had the competitive attitude, the attitude that I can beat my disability. And
I'd see Terry after his cancer treatments with no hair, sick and throwing up, but he saw it every day when he was at the cancer clinic, and a lot of them weren't going to make it or were dying.
This changed Terry forever. I mean, he would be the first person to say prior to losing his leg to cancer that he was self-centered, that he thought only of himself. But that's why I always said that cancer was a good thing, because it told him how important it was to think about other people and want to give to other people.
When Terry found out that cancer research was poorly funded, he started thinking about what he could do to help. And despite the chemotherapy, the old Terry Fox spirit was still there.
I was always looking for new recruits, guys like me that had had a disability and used to play basketball beforehand. And I was having dinner with a friend one night, and they told me about this guy who played JV basketball for Simon Fraser University, and he'd lost his leg to cancer. And his name was Terry Fox, and so I said, hey, sounds good. Give me his number, and I'll call him up.
Terry's wheelchair athletics earned him a Canadian basketball championship and an introduction to a volleyball coach.
He could be like a wall, you know, and even if he was wrong, he would stick to his point just because he was stubborn.
What are you doing, John?
He really didn't want to express himself in tender ways, I guess, in front of people. So he covered that with a bit of gruffness and a lot of horseplay.
2 days ago. But you didn't get here until today. What a smarty.
I think there was certainly a relationship there for sure, and more than just a friendship. But that changed as Terry became more serious about the Marathon of Hope. And that was, I'm sure, difficult for both of them to have to make. They both made sacrifices.
Terry had changed his focus from wheelchair sports to running. He was regularly covering up to 10 miles a day.
Sometimes I would ride beside him on my bike with water. And whenever he would need water, he'd just stick his hand out, and that meant water. So I'd ride up, give him the water. He'd glug glug, throw it aside. I had to go and grovel in the ditch for the water and then get on my bike and follow him again.
Terry had run over 3,000 miles in training. Now he was up for another challenge. Doug Allward and Rick Hansen were entered in the Prince George Marathon on Labor Day 1979. When Terry found out, there was no holding him back.
It was a 17-mile race, and Terry had never done that kind of distance before under that kind of formal circumstance, and everybody had completed the journey, right down to the last person. And people were sort of looking at their watches, and they were talking about, well, there's one guy left out there, he's a guy with one leg, and maybe we should just close it off and tell him it's time to go.
We kept looking down the road, and I thought, he'll be here. If he has to crawl, he'll be here. Sure enough, he came running across, big smile.
When I got to that point, I told my parents, and then sometime in September or October, I approached Blair Mackenzie of the Cancer Society.
He told the Cancer Society of his plan to run across the country and raise money for cancer research. Although skeptical, they offered their support. But he couldn't do it on his own.
The way things worked out, nobody else could go. And I could. I even said up to the last minute, does anybody else want to sit in a van and go across Canada? And nobody else did, or nobody else was available. So I ended up doing it.
Looking back, it was a harebrained scheme. Terry with Doug as his sole companion. Furthermore, there were other complications.
Before Terry went on the run, he started experiencing some dizziness, fainting spells, seeing double, triple, quadruple vision. So he said, I will never forgive you if you tell anyone. And he meant it.
The doctors thought something was wrong with his heart, but Terry wasn't going to say anything. Because I think what it came down to was we only got one life to live. I might die of cancer anyway. And Terry had decided this was what he was going to do.
I've trained as hard as I think you can train for it. Before Christmas, I ran 101 days in a row without taking a day off. Christmas Day was my first day off in 101 days. In that time, I ran with the flu, shin splints, bone bruises. You name it, I had it. And I ran through it at that time because I felt I had to build my confidence for my trip, and because I knew when I run across Canada, I'm going to encounter the same things.
With a few dollars of sponsorship money, Terry and Doug flew to Newfoundland, and on the 12th of April, 1980, the Marathon of Hope began.
This afternoon at 2:45 in St. John's Harbor, Terry Fox dipped his foot into the waters of the Atlantic Ocean.
I remember picking up a newspaper, and there was Terry's picture on the front page, and he had just dipped his leg in the Atlantic Ocean, He had this dream and this goal to raise money for cancer, but to run across Canada. And when I read the article and looked at his picture, and there was something that kind of overwhelmed me to think that this is a guy with a lot of guts and determination.
Each and every day, Terry ran 26 miles, fighting against the bitter tail end of a Newfoundland winter. His artificial leg gave him problems. His stump would bleed. The pain was intense. On occasions, the dizzy spells and double vision would return, but he adamantly refused to take a day off.
I was to find out if he was credible. And I knew instantly he was. You could tell in his voice. There was this sincerity, this youthful optimism, this energy, this absolute sureness that he was going to do this remarkable feat.
One morning I woke up and I couldn't get out of bed, and that day they told me I had a malignant tumor and that I had to have my leg amputated in 4 days. And I decided after my 1.5 years of chemotherapy that I'd try and run across Canada and raise as much money as I could for the Canadian Cancer Society.
It was a remarkable performance by any standard. For Terry Fox, an intensely shy young man, it was outstanding. Yet the pressures of running the solitary campaign were intense.
This is not a motorhome that they're in. This is a van that they lived in, they slept in, they cooked in. The toilet was in the back. It smelled absolutely horrendous.
After about 2 weeks into the run, I thought, what have I got myself into? Because we'd already had a few little arguments.
There's not too many people who would go through what Doug had to go through. It wasn't an easy thing for him, and there was nothing in it for him, but he did it out of friendship for Terry.
The boys argued about everything, from who would empty the toilet to who was responsible for the lack of publicity. And all the while, the less than overwhelming donations made Doug and Terry question what they were doing. But then came a small triumph. When Terry ran through Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, the 10,000 people who lived there did themselves proud and gave over $10,000. Up to that point, Terry aimed to raise $1 million from his run. But that day, as he headed for Nova Scotia, he was beginning to think big. A national goal of $1 for every person in the land.
I remember him saying, I've run 26 miles today and every day, but I don't seem to be getting a whole lot of financial support. What's wrong? And so what we did was I went out into the parking lot and I called the local radio station in Amherst. And I talked to a young fellow, Ron Bickle, and I said, you know, this guy's running so hard. What can we do to help the cause?
I said, well, I can do an interview after I get off the air, which is at 8 o'clock. She said, great, we'll have him at a phone booth at Wentworth Park. He'll be there.
Terry was reached by CKDH News last night as he stopped overnight in Wentworth.
I have the attitude that no matter what happens, I'm going to keep going and never give up. So when I'm tired, I think of the people that have cancer and just remember I'm setting an example for other people and try and keep going and do my best.
He hadn't been on the road yet a month, and he hadn't gotten the media coverage that he should have gotten at that point in time. But I'll tell you, it picked up, and pretty soon, every night on the news, you could see Terry Fox and where he was, and communities started to want to have him visit.
Raising $7,000 in the tiny town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, was an isolated success story. Yet the tension between Terry and Doug was becoming almost unbearable.
It was within, I believe, 2 weeks that there was a decision made that I would join Terry. And the reason for it, honestly, was that, at this point, Doug and Terry had been traveling for a month and a half. They were confined to a van. My primary job description was to protect Doug and Terry from killing one another, basically.
He was really special to Terry. He was his punching bag a lot of times, but Daryl just rolled with it. He was that kind of person, you know, and he could turn any tense situation into a laughable one. I think the run would have fallen apart if he hadn't gone. I really believe that.
It was an opportunity of a lifetime, and I knew it. I knew, you know, though I was obviously very young and immature at the time, I knew that this is something that I will remember for the rest of my life, and felt very privileged that Terry had asked me to be there. I've always thought about obviously passing on the story to my children, and have done so with my wife over the years as well. But to show them the monument was certainly a wonderful opportunity. The monument is very impressive, and it's I think it's really captured the power of Terry Fox and how he ran. And it to me is the way I remember Terry as being larger than life.
Uncle Terry had to stop his run, and he's still running, I think.
I realize that, you know, what I do now cannot change the past. I've learned to accept that. But I'm driven by what I perhaps can change in the future. You know, I have 2 young children that I hope they don't have to go through what Terry had to go through.
One day I'm sitting at my desk and the boss comes by and throws me a memo. And it was literally 3 sentences, and he said, there's some kid running across Canada with 1 leg. We want to go see what you can do for him.
Do you want to go run? It's a waste of time. Or do you want to talk to him? Do you want to make a couple calls? No, I would do it after. Okay.
The biggest thing about Bill Viggers is he was such an optimist. He believed in big things. And I think that Bill Viggers' vision of impacting a lot of people kind of matched Terry's vision.
When you saw how he affected people in the rural areas in eastern Canada, where the next driveway was a mile down the road, and there'd be a small clutch, and usually a family standing at the end of the road, and I simply took it and saying, when you take them into a populated area, you could see what was probably going to happen.
Bill's job was to drum up financial support for the Cancer Society in Ontario. And while he went off to prepare for that part of the marathon, Terry, Daryl, and Doug were left to get across Quebec on their own. No one spoke or understood French. There was no publicity machine, and sadly the message never made an impression in most of La Belle Province.
We crossed the border. We had intended to run on the highway, and we were told that you can't run here. You know, you're a danger. You're causing a hazard to traffic and to yourself. And we were forced off onto a road running along the St. Lawrence River.
In a 100-mile stretch, they only raised $35. The only thing that kept them going was the promise of better days to come. In Ottawa, Bill Viggers had done his job well, and a media circus would sweep Terry along his path. Terry Fox was now news. It was the start of something big. People lined the route, and money started to pour in. But there was a downside to all the hoopla. After long hours of constant running in sweltering, muggy Ontario weather, Terry was in demand to speak at lunches and dinners, often well out of the way of the route.
That would make me happy would be to run as many miles as I could today and get as close to Vancouver as I can.
There were times where Terry was very angry that Bill would organize things that he was not expecting in a time frame that he could not keep. And I remember him calling me once saying how frustrated he was getting because he had to make all these side trips.
We had this big blow-up one day about I wasn't listening to him. I wasn't following his guidelines. And that did devastate me because you were trying to do what he wanted. At the same time, I was having to keep the Cancer Society happy. That alone was another story, because most of the times the senior executive of the Cancer Society were on a totally different plane. They were afraid that this phenomena was going to overtake the Cancer Society.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Terry Fox!
Terry was now constantly in the public eye, and the media attention wasn't all positive. One reporter, seeing blood running down Terry's artificial leg, said he was being pushed too hard. Another painted him as a tyrant, ordering his crew around. And for Terry, it was like a slap in the face.
Everything he said was practically, he turned around into something that wasn't, he rephrased it. And it's crap. The bad experience with the first physician didn't frame my attitude at all.
Well, he asked me.
That was my attitude right from the start. I never saw the doctor until my leg was in pain. I don't like going to doctors.
This woman in a car, and she's very upset, and she starts yelling at the window, "They're using you, they're using you, they're using you." And he stopped, which he never did, and he came over and he was very nice, but he walked up to the lady and he said, "They're not using me enough." And just turned and ran off.
Nobody will ever forget the drama that played out here at the Scarborough Civic Center. Terry had run himself into the ground. He was mentally and physically exhausted, and it showed.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls, for welcoming with me this courageous, determined young man who has come to Scarborough today.
I remember that he said something snarky, having been criticized along the way for not doing this, not doing that, and he did make a statement about, you know, don't blame it on anybody else, blame it on me.
When you're cheering and clapping me, you're not just clearing and clapping me, because there's so many other people involved in the run that nobody hears about. There's my brother and Doug, and
for me, it was looking at the motorcycle officers and the tears running down their face. And I thought at that moment that we were seeing something that we would remember for the rest of our lives.
Bill Diggers is a man from the Cancer Society. See, I'm trying my very best. I run as hard as I can all day. I do my best in PR. And sometimes we have to change the schedule. And whenever we have to do that, he has to tell people ahead of time. And he gets all the shit for it, and I don't feel good. Anybody who complains about any change in schedule, come up to me and tell me I'm not trying hard enough. Don't give it to him.
I'm speechless right now, my goodness. I'm just so moved by the whole thing. He's an inspiration to us all. I'm just overwhelmed.
It was like your greatest ride. You just didn't want it to end. Every day was so exciting. And just watching Terry run, that was the thrill of it all for us.
When Terry arrived at the Ontario-Quebec border, the president of the Ontario Cancer Society asked if there was anything special that they could do as a society for him when he comes through Ontario. And Terry had two requests. He wanted the opportunity to meet Bobby Orr and to meet Daryl Sittler. Little did he know that I wanted to meet him as much as he wanted to meet me.
He ran down University Avenue with Daryl Sittler. People were pouring out of, the women were coming out of the hairdressing salons with curlers in their hairs. People were coming out of the hospitals on University Avenue with their lab coats on. I mean, they stopped what they were doing to see this young man. It was amazing to all of us.
Thousands cheered Terry Fox that day at Toronto City Hall. More important to Terry was the $100,000 that was raised for cancer research.
I kept saying, what can I do that would be special for him? I drove out to my home in Mississauga and grabbed my all-star sweater. Put it in a brown paper bag. It wasn't wrapped up or anything like that. And then presented it to him on stage at City Hall. And he, you know, the fact that he put it on and wore it and we held his hand up was very meaningful and emotional. But I knew from my heart I wanted him to have that jersey.
In that brutal summer heat, Terry headed for southern Ontario on a route that got him no closer to home, but added miles to his fundraising drive. Yet now he was cheered on at every corner and along every highway and byway.
Thank you.
Corporate sponsorship was now booming, led by hotel magnate Isidore Sharp, who himself had lost a son to cancer. Yet Terry wanted people to focus on his message, and he steadfastly refused to do endorsements. Returning to Toronto, his second wish came true when he finally met Bobby Orr. He was on top of the world and heading home.
It was incredible today. Unreal.
What do you want most right now?
Right now, what do I want most? More money.
You're getting it. You're getting it.
Terry spent his 22nd birthday doing what he enjoyed most, running. And in Terrace Bay, on the shores of Lake Superior, he would be reminded once again of the reason for his marathon.
I'm crying now because there's somebody here right now who is going through the same thing that I went through. Exact same thing, and he's only 10 years old. And I had the most inspirational day of my life today.
Greg Scott was a little boy, 10 years of age, who had suffered the same cruel fate as Terry Fox. He affected Terry enormously, particularly when the terminally ill youngster was flown north from his home in Hamilton to cycle alongside him.
With Greg Scott there, 14 miles first thing in the morning was just easy. And then he did 12 more, got his day over with. That's what he was doing it for, the young kids who were dying of cancer.
We'd all gone out to dinner, and we were just on our way back to the motel. And we came upon this lake, and it was a warm night, and the lake was still, and they said, well, let's go for a swim. So we just pulled over, and in they went.
And that night, it turned into like a family picnic. It was the reverse of Terry meeting his heroes. Greg was meeting his hero. This was his Daryl Sittler. This was his Bobby Orr.
But this would be the last time that Terry Fox and Greg Scott would ever meet. Those around Terry had started to suspect that all was not well.
Something happened during that period. Terry became more irritable. I mean, this was something that wasn't there in the earlier stages. He became obsessed with mileage. Not only did he want to know how far he'd gone, more importantly, he wanted to know how far he still had to go to get home. And yet we were over 2,000 miles away. So it was during this period that I think I began to realize that something was wrong.
When Terry comes off the road and says, I need to see a doctor, something's really wrong. Yeah, I believe it's diagnosed as collapsed lung, and they took Terry to the hospital.
It was on September 1st, 1980, that the end of the marathon came. Terry's mileage stood at 3,339. He'd run for 142 days with only one day off. 10 miles outside of Thunder Bay, the Terry Fox Marathon of Hope was over.
I picked up the phone. It was Terry. And I said, Terry, what's wrong? I hear you're very sick. He said, I've got cancer in my lungs now.
The ambulance attendants were bringing him in on a stretcher, and it was a narrow hallway. and the stretcher wouldn't fit. You know, I mean, they couldn't bend it and couldn't get it easily in the room. They finally did, and there was a fly that landed on his cheek and walked across his face, and he was too weak to brush it away. You know, and it was just awful. And I remember it really, really clearly, and I just felt so terrible for him.
I had noticed a little bit of hardness in breathing, and near the end of the day, 18 miles, I was coughing and choking and had pain in my neck and my chest. And I did 3 more miles, and I decided I had to go see the doctor. And it was discovered then that originally I had primary cancer in my knee 3.5 years ago. And that the cancer had spread, and now I've got cancer in my lungs. And we got to go home and try and do some more treatment. But all I can say is if there's any way I can get out there again and finish it, I will.
Terry was flown home to Vancouver and immediately went to Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster.
He wanted to walk down to this news conference, and they wouldn't let him. They made him go in a wheelchair, and so he went in it down to the room where the press conference is, and then he got out of the chair and he walked in. There was, I mean, poor kid, he could hardly walk, he could hardly stand.
Like, I'm not surprised by anything anymore, and this is the way life is. I'm not the only one who is in this situation. There are a lot of people in a lot worse situation, and just got to take one day at a time and do my best. I'm not bitter at anybody or anything.
I remember Terry saying, it's almost like this has been planned for a greater purpose.
3 days later, Terry began his second chemotherapy treatments. The whole country held its breath and offered up its prayers. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he watched a hastily convened coast-to-coast network telethon that more than doubled the amount he had already raised. More importantly, the fund soon reached more than $24 million, realizing Terry's goal of raising $1 for every Canadian.
Do you expect this kind of reaction?
Not really. Not really at all. I'm really happy about it all. It makes me feel like it didn't matter that right now I haven't finished it. People really care about what I attempted to do.
To receive the insignia of a Companion of the Order of Canada.
For 10 months, Terry Fox fought the disease that had made his name a byword for courage and commitment. Honors were heaped on the young athlete. He became the youngest ever recipient of the Order of Canada. But it was a cruel irony that someone who had single-handedly raised a sum equal to twice the Cancer Society's annual research budget could not benefit from his own efforts.
I think that by having some faith that God is there, that, you know, believing in heaven is something that will relieve me of that loneliness, you know.
He died surrounded by love. The love of his family, all of whom were with him, and the love and prayers of the entire nation.
It would have been difficult to find anybody that summer who was not deeply affected by the death of Terry Fox. But his brave spirit would continue to inspire people everywhere. And his dream, which had become his legacy, would soon provide a national focus for fighting the disease, which had struck him down at such a young age.
I've said to people before that I'm going to do my very best to make it. I'm not going to give up, and that's true. But I might not make it, and if I don't make it, the marathon of hope better continue.
He kind of woke up at one point and looked at me,
and said, you know, Coach, is what I did, is it going to have made a difference? And I said, Terry, I think it's made all the difference. You've given people a dream, and that dream people will keep alive.
Today, the Terry Fox Foundation is the keeper of the dream, each year organizing the Terry Fox Run.
This is an idea to approach. Now there's a big commitment on your...
1, 2, 3.
The idea came from Isidore Sharp, who wanted to turn his support for Terry's Marathon of Hope into a lasting legacy.
So I suggested to him, what if we hold a run in your honor each year? He said, that sounds okay.
The Terry Fox Run now takes place each year in more than 5,000 locations across Canada and around the world.
It's not just a fundraiser. Everybody here feels they can understand what Terry was all about.
He left such an indelible mark in all of us. You know, we knew, though, in our hearts that we would never forget him.
In a country reluctant to recognize its heroes, Terry Fox stands alone. But heroism was the furthest thing from Terry's mind. The epitaph he would appreciate is the hope that he still inspires.
He had a tremendous impact on all of us and on everybody who goes into the cancer clinic one day and gets told that you're going to be okay, and you're going to be okay because we've had funding and we've had research, and you know, that's important. Those are big words to hear.
He was a natural. He was going to raise $1 from every Canadian. He was not pretentious. He evolved and he grew, and there was a greater depth to him, and we responded to that.
Mrs. Smile, miss having the opportunity to just hug him, everything. Miss him very much.
If it doesn't work out, I've got to be able to accept it, and people have got to realize that good things and bad things happen in the world, and Terry Fox is somebody who tried his hardest, and even though I died of cancer, my spirit didn't die, and I kept trying, and that should influence a lot of people as well.
If there's doubt and you're cold, don't you worry what the future holds. We gotta have heroes to teach us all to never give up on a dream. Claim the road, touch the sun. No force on earth could stop you run. When your heart bursts like the sun, never, never give up on a dream. Shadows fall, daylight dies. Freedom never got a place to hide. Search forever for the finish line. Never give up on